Hi friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager of the PV Library. Thank you for joining me for day 2 of our read along together of Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. I would actually really appreciate your help if anyone wants to comment on an adjective we can use. Like I've tried to sometimes to have like kind of little fun little openings, like how we had like howdy readers for Roughing It, and yeah. I feel like is it weird to say like hello, like for our printed little description, sorry. Would it be weird to say hello, like angsty readers, anguished readers, brooding readers, gothic readers? Or are we just gonna be readers? So let me know if you guys have an adjective you think would be fun to add on there. Otherwise, maybe we might just stay readers, but hello readers, hello friends. So yesterday we read 2 chapters plus the introduction, which was written by Charlotte Brontë, Emily's sister. I'm gonna go ahead and pour myself out some tea. Today's tea that I'm enjoying is a herbal tea, which I have lost the little packaging for it, but it was the sweet and spicy herbal tea. I've had this one before. It's just a fun little refreshing tea. Yeah, like the cinnamon and the clove. It just has that nice kind of bright, invigorating feel to it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we read yesterday. I'm really excited about this one. We started with the introduction, and the reason I included that was just a couple of reasons. I thought it was interesting how Charlotte Brontë had written this thing about her sister. There were also a few little elements in there where Charlotte was talking about her sister Emily and how she was reserved, she was quiet, she didn't really talk to people, she rarely left the home, and yet despite that she was observant. And that it was what she observed that she was putting into her story. Also her own like thoughts that, you know, Charlotte's opinion that Heathcliff would basically have been a demon himself, but for the love that he showed for a couple of the characters, which I will not say again because I realized there's a couple spoilers in there, which if you haven't read the story before, I hope I didn't give anything too much away. It's a really famous story though, so I'm hoping that you kind of know the basics of it and what we're going to discover. So one of the things that's interesting about the story, and I sort of alluded to it at the end, and then I sort of said we'd wait. Wuthering Heights is told with a fractured timeline. It starts out where Heathcliff is an older man. Lockwood is a new resident in the neighborhood. Let me go. Guess we're doing our description now. In chapter 1, we meet Mr. Lockwood, and he is a new resident in the neighborhood. He's moved to Yorkshire for some reason. He's renting a residence from Mr. Heathcliff, and he's kind of a little bit bored and lonely, so he goes over to see his new landlord. And when he meets Mr. Heathcliff, he is surprised at how gruff he is, how stern he is, and rather a bit uncouth, you know. Heathcliff is not well-mannered, and there's also, he decides that he wants to further the acquaintance because there's really not very many people out there in Yorkshire for him to socialize with. And so the next day he decides to go back to Wuthering Heights, the home of Mr. Heathcliff. And when he goes there, the rest of the people are like, well, why are you here? No one invited you, no one wanted you here. He's like, but I'm here. And so they bring him inside and he meets some other residents of Wuthering Heights. In addition to Heathcliff, there is a young woman who eventually he learns is Heathcliff's daughter-in-law. There is a young man named Hareton Earnshaw who is, he's not quite sure. Mr. Lockwood isn't sure, like it's not Heathcliff's son. It's not the spouse of Mrs. Heathcliff, the widow. It is, he seems like he might belong to the house somehow, but he's not quite a servant, and so it's unsure what his relationship to the family is. What we're going to, I think we'll get into it today, but basically what we're starting with is this kind of more present day for Wuthering Heights, and then we're going to, most of the rest of the story we're going to get is a look back into the past as to what led to these course of events where they're living now when Mr. Lockwood meets them. So we'll find out more about these mysterious characters, their odd interactions with each other, their seeming dislike, maybe even hatred for each other. There's just like this weird energy seething at Wuthering Heights, and he's Mr. Lockwood, the outsider, is observing this and just sort of bothered by it and also a little intrigued by it, it seems. He does, as the snow is starting to come down, he tries to go back to his house, but he's unable to do it. He's unable to navigate on his own because it's just so blustery. He's not going to be able to make it through the storm. And so they do agree to let him stay. The servant Zillah, she agrees to bring, to take care of Mr. Lockwood. And so she brings him back. She gives him like gives him some brandy, and then, you know, brings him over to settle him in for the night. And so we'll continue the story from there. One more time, I will try to not say this too many times, but I do want to apologize once again for my sad excuse for a Yorkshire accent. It is not pretty, but I'll keep trying. So let's go in. I suspect he's going to be talking with some servants again, and we're going to have some more of my bad accents. Let's go. 2 more chapters. Today we're going to read chapters 3 and 4 of Wuthering Heights. Let's see if we stay in the present day or if we start to get back into the past and find out what led to the circumstances that we found yesterday. All right, chapter 3 of Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. While leading the way upstairs, she recommended that I should hide the candle and not make a noise, for her master had an odd notion about the chamber she would put me in, and never let anybody lodge there willingly. She answered, she had only lived there a year or 2, and they had so many queer goings-on, she could not begin to be curious. Too stupefied to be curious myself, I fastened my door and glanced round for the bed. The whole furniture consisted of a chair, a clothes press, and a large oak case, with squares cut out near the top, resembling coach windows. Having approached the structure, I looked inside and perceived it to be a singular sort of old-fashioned couch, very conveniently designed to obviate the necessity for every member of the family having a room to himself. In fact, it formed a little closet, and the ledge of a window, which it enclosed, served as a table. I slid back the paneled sides, got in with my light, pulled them together again, and felt secure against the vigilance of Heathcliff and everyone else. The ledge where I placed my candle had a few mildewed books piled up in the corner, and it was covered with writing scratched on the paint. This writing, however, was nothing but a name repeated in all kinds of characters, large and small. Catherine Earnshaw. Here and there varied to Catherine Heathcliff, and then again to Catherine Linton. In vapid listlessness, I leant my head against the window and continued spelling over Catherine Earnshaw, Heathcliff, Linton, till my eyes closed. But they had not rested 5 minutes when a glare of white letters started from the dark, as vivid as specters. The air swarmed with Catherines, and rousing myself to dispel the obtrusive name, I discovered my candle wick reclining on one of the antique volumes and perfuming the place with an odor of roasted calfskin. I snuffed it out, and very ill at ease under the influence of cold and lingering nausea, sat up and spread open the injured tome on my knee. It was a testament in lean type and smelling dreadfully musty. A fly-leaf bore the inscription, Catherine Earnshaw, her book, and it dates some 1/4 of a century back. I shut it and took up another, and another, till I had examined all. Catherine's library was select, and its state of dilapidation proved it to have been well used, though not altogether for a legitimate purpose. Scarcely one chapter had escaped a pen and ink commentary, at least the appearance of one, covering every morsel of blank that the printer had left. Some were detached sentences, other parts took the form of a regular diary, scrawled in an unformed, childish hand. At the top of an extra page, quite a treasure probably when first lighted on, I was greatly amused to behold an excellent caricature of my friend Joseph, rudely yet powerfully sketched. An immediate interest kindled within me for the unknown Catherine, and I began forthwith to decipher her faded hieroglyphics. An awful Sunday, commenced the paragraph beneath. I wish my father were back again. Hindley is a detestable substitute. His conduct to Heathcliff is atrocious. H and I are going to rebel. We took our initiatory step this evening. All day had been flooding with rain. We could not go to church, so Joseph must needs get up a congregation in the garret. And while Hindley and his wife basked downstairs before a comfortable fire, doing anything but reading their Bibles, I'll answer for it, Heathcliff, myself, and the unhappy ploughboy were commanded to take our prayer books and mount. We were ranged in a row on a sack of corn, groaning and shivering, and hoping that Joseph would shiver too, so that he might give us a short homily for his own sake. A vain idea. The service lasted precisely 3 hours. And yet my brother had the face to exclaim when he saw us descending, "What? Done already?" On Sunday evenings we used to be permitted to play if we did not make much noise. Now a mere titter is sufficient to send us into corners. "You forget you have a master here," says the tyrant. I'll demolish the first who puts me out of temper. I insist on perfect sobriety and silence." "Oh, boy, was that you? Francis, darling, pull his hair as you go by. I heard him snap his fingers." Frances pulled his hair heartily and then went and seated herself on her husband's knee. And there they were, like two babies, kissing and talking nonsense by the hour. Foolish palaver that we should be ashamed of. We made ourselves as snug as our means allowed in the arch of the dresser. I had just fastened our pinafores together and hung them up for a curtain when in comes Joseph on an errand from the stables. He tears down my handiwork, boxes my ears, and croaks, "To Maister Nobbut just buried, and Sabbath not o'ered, and to sand on't gospel still in your lungs, and ye dar be liking shame on ye. Sit ye down, ill childer. They's good books enough if you'll read 'em. Sit ye down and think ye your souls." Saying this, he compelled us to square our positions that we might receive from the far-off fire a dull ray to show us the text of the lumber he thrust upon us. I could not bear the employment. I took my dingy volume by the scroop and hurled it into the dog kennel, vowing I hated a good book. Heathcliff kicked his to the same place. Then there was a hubbub. "Maister Hindley," shouted our chaplain, "Maister, come hither. Miss Cathy's riven the back off the helmet on salvation. And Heathcliff paused his fit into the first part of to broad way to destruction. It's fair flaysome at you let him go on this gate. Ta old man 'ud a laced him properly, but he's gone." Hindley hurried up from his paradise on the hearth, and seizing one of us by the collar and the other by the arm, hurled both into the back kitchen, where Joseph asseverated "Aud Nick" would fetch us as soon as we were living, and so comforted, we each sought a separate nook to await his advent. I reached this book and a pot of ink from the shelf, and pushed the house door ajar to give me light, and I have got the time on with writing for 20 minutes. But my companion is impatient and proposes that we should appropriate the dairy woman's cloak and have a scamper on the moors under its shelter. A pleasant suggestion, and then, if the surly old man come in, he may believe his prophecy verified. We cannot be damper or colder in the rain than we are here. I suppose Catherine fulfilled her project, for the next sentence took up another subject. She waxed lachrymose. "How little did I dream that Hindley would ever make me cry so," she wrote. "My head aches till I cannot keep it on the pillow, and still I can't give over. Poor Heathcliff! Hindley calls him a vagabond and won't let him sit with us nor eat with us any more. And he says he and I must not play together, and threatens to turn him out of the house if we break his orders. He has been blaming our father, how dared he, for treating H too liberally, and swears he will reduce him to his right place." I began to nod drowsily over the dim page. My eye wandered from manuscript to print. I saw a red ornamented title, 70 times 7 and the first of the 71st, a pious discourse delivered by the Reverend Jabez Branderham in the chapel of Gimmerden Sow. And while I was, half-consciously, worrying my brain to guess what Jabez Branderham would make of his subject, I sank back in bed and fell asleep. Alas, for the effects of bad tea and bad temper! What else could it be that made me pass such a terrible night? I don't remember another that I can at all compare with it since I was capable of suffering. I began to dream, almost before I ceased to be sensible of my locality. I thought it was morning, and I had set out on my way home with Joseph for a guide. The snow lay yards deep in our road, and as we floundered on, my companion wearied me with constant reproaches that I had not brought a pilgrim's staff, telling me that I could never get into the house without one, and boastfully flourishing a heavy-handed cudgel, which I understood to be so denominated. For a moment I considered it absurd that I should need such a weapon to gain admittance into my own residence. Then a new idea flashed across me. I was not going there. We were journeying to hear the famous Jabez Branderham preach from the text, 70 times 7. And either Joseph, the preacher, or I had committed the first of the 71st, and were to be publicly exposed and excommunicated. We came to the chapel. I have passed it really in my walks, twice or thrice. It lies in a hollow between two hills, an elevated hollow near a swamp, whose peaty moisture is said to answer all the purposes of embalming on the few corpses deposited there. The roof has been kept whole hitherto, but as the clergyman's stipend is only £20 per annum, and a house with 2 rooms threatening speedily to determine into one, no clergyman will undertake the duties of pastor, especially as it is currently reported that his flock would rather let him starve than increase the living by 1 penny from their own pockets. However, in my dream, Jabez had a full and attentive congregation, and he preached. Good God, what a sermon divided into 490 parts, each fully equal to an ordinary address from the pulpit, and each discussing a separate sin. Where he searched for them, I cannot tell. He had his private manner of interpreting the phrase, and it seemed necessary the brother should sin different sins on every occasion. They were of the most curious character, odd transgressions that I never imagined previously. Oh, how weary I grew, how I writhed and yawned and nodded and revived, how I pinched and pricked myself and rubbed my eyes and stood up and sat down again and nudged Joseph to inform me if we would ever have done. I was condemned to hear all out. Finally, he reached the first of the 71st. At that crisis, a sudden inspiration descended on me. I was moved to rise and denounce Jabez Branderham as the sinner of the sin that no Christian need pardon. Sir, I exclaimed, sitting here within these 4 walls at one stretch, I have endured and forgiven the 490 heads of your discourse. 70 times 7 times have I plucked up my hat and been about to depart. 70 times 7 times have you preposterously forced me to resume my seat. The 491st is too much. Fellow martyrs, have at him. Drag him down and crush him to atoms, that the place which knows him may know him no more. Thou art the man, cried Jabez after a solemn pause, leaning over his cushion. 70 times 7 times didst thou gapingly contort thy visage. 70 times 7 did I take counsel with my soul. Lo, this is human weakness. This also may be absolved. The first of the 71st is come. Brethren, execute upon him the judgment written. Such honor have all his saints. With that concluding word, the whole assembly, exalting their pilgrim staves, rushed round me in a body, and I, having no weapon to raise in self-defense, commenced grappling with Joseph, my nearest and most ferocious assailant, for his. In the confluence of the multitude, several clubs crossed. Blows aimed at me fell on other sconces. Presently, the whole chapel resounded with rappings and counter-rappings. Every man's hand was against his neighbor, and Branderham, unwilling to remain idle, poured forth his zeal in a shower of loud taps on the boards of the pulpit, which responded so smartly that at last, to my unspeakable relief, they woke me. And what was it that had suggested the tremendous tumult? What had played Jabez's part in the row? Merely the branches of a fir tree that touched my lattice as the blast wailed by, and rattled its dry cones against the panes. I listened doubtingly an instant, detected the disturber, then turned and dozed and dreamt again, if possible, still more disagreeably than before. This time, I remembered I was lying in the oak closet, and I heard distinctly the gusty wind and the driving of the snow. I heard also the fir bough repeat its teasing sound and ascribed it to the right cause. But it annoyed me so much that I resolved to silence it if possible, and, I thought, I rose and endeavored to unhasp the casement. The hook was soldered into the staple, a circumstance observed by me when awake, but forgotten. I must stop it nevertheless, I muttered, knocking my knuckles through the glass and stretching an arm out to seize the importunate branch. Instead of which, my fingers closed on the fingers of a little, ice-cold hand. The intense horror of nightmare came over me. I tried to draw back my arm, but the hand clung to it, and a most melancholy voice sobbed, "Let me in! Let me in!" "Who are you?" I asked, struggling meanwhile to disengage myself. "Catherine Linton," it replied shiveringly. Why did I think of Linton? I had read Earnshaw 20 times for Linton. "I'm come home. I'd lost my way on the moor." As it spoke, I discerned obscurely a child's face looking through the window. Terror made me cruel, and finding it useless to attempt shaking the creature off, I pulled its wrist onto the broken pane and rubbed it to and fro till the blood ran down and soaked the bedclothes. Still, it wailed, "Let me in," and maintained its tenacious gripe, almost maddening me with fear. "How can I said at length. "Let me go if you want me to let you in." The fingers relaxed. I snatched mine through the hole, hurriedly piled the books up in a pyramid against it, and stopped my ears to exclude the lamentable prayer. I seemed to keep them closed above a quarter of an hour, yet the instant I listened again, there was a doleful cry, moaning on. "Begone!" I shouted. "I'll never let you in, not if you beg for 20 years!" "It is 20 years," mourned the voice. 20 years! I've been a waif for 20 years. Thereat began a feeble scratching outside, and the pile of books moved as if thrust forward. I tried to jump up, but could not stir a limb, and so yelled aloud in a frenzy of fright. To my confusion, I discovered the yell was not ideal. Hasty footsteps approached my chamber door. Somebody pushed it open with a vigorous hand, and a light glimmered through the squares at the top of the bed. I sat shuddering yet, and wiping the perspiration from my forehead. The intruder appeared to hesitate and muttered to himself. At last, he said in a half-whisper, plainly not expecting an answer, "Is anyone here?" I considered it best to confess my presence, for I knew Heathcliff's accents and feared he might search further if I kept quiet. With this intention, I turned and opened the panels. I shall not soon forget the effect my action produced. Heathcliff stood near the entrance in his shirt and trousers, with a candle dripping over his fingers, and his face as white as the wall behind him. The first creak of the oak startled him like an electric shock. The light leapt from his hold to a distance of some feet, and his agitation was so extreme that he could hardly pick it up. "It is only your guest, sir," I called out, desirous to spare him the humiliation of exposing his cowardice further. "I had the misfortune to scream in my sleep, owing to a frightful nightmare. I am sorry I disturbed you." "Oh, God confound you, Mr. Lockwood. I wish you were at the—" commenced my host, settling the candle on a chair because he found it impossible to hold it steady. "And who showed you up to this room?" he continued, crushing his nails into his palms and grinding his teeth to subdue the maxillary convulsions. "Who was it? I've a good mind to turn them out of the house this moment." "It was your servant Zillah," I answered, flinging myself onto the floor and rapidly resuming my garments. "I should not care if you did, Mr. Heathcliff. She richly deserves it. I suppose that she wanted to get another proof that the place was haunted at my expense. Well, it is, swarming with ghosts and goblins. You have reason in shutting it up, I assure you. No one will thank you for a dose in such a den." "What do you mean?" asked Heathcliff. "And what are you doing? Lie down and finish out the night, since you are here. But for heaven's sake, don't repeat that horrid noise. Nothing could excuse it unless you were having your throat cut. If the little fiend had got in at the window, she probably would have strangled me, I returned. I'm not going to endure the persecutions of your hospitable ancestors again. Was not the Reverend Jabez Branderham akin to you on your mother's side, or on the mother's side? And that minx, Catherine Linton, or Earnshaw, or however she was called, she must have been a changeling, wicked little soul. She told me she had been walking the earth these 20 years, a just punishment for her mortal transgressions, I've no doubt. Scarcely were these words uttered when I recollected the association of Heathcliff's with Catherine's name in the book, which had completely slipped my memory till thus awakened. I blushed at my inconsideration, but without showing further consciousness of the offense, I hastened to add, "The truth is, sir, I passed the first part of the night in—" Here I stopped afresh. I was about to say, perusing those old volumes. Then it would have revealed my knowledge of their written, as well as their printed contents. So, correcting myself, I went on, "In spelling over the names scratched on that window ledge, a monotonous occupation calculated to set me asleep, like counting or—" "What can you mean by talking in this way to me?" thundered Heathcliff, with savage vehemence. How dare you, under my roof? God, he's mad to speak so, and he struck his forehead with rage. I did not know whether to resent this language or pursue my explanation, but he seemed so powerfully affected that I took pity and proceeded with my dreams, affirming I had never heard the appellation of Catherine Linton before, but reading it often overproduced an impression which personified itself when I had no longer my imagination under control. Heathcliff gradually fell back into the shelter of the bed as I spoke, finally sitting down almost concealed behind it. I guessed, however, by his irregular and intercepted breathing, that he struggled to vanquish an excess of violent emotion. Not liking to show him that I heard the conflict, I continued my toilette rather noisily, looked at my watch, and soliloquized on the length of the night. Not 3 o'clock yet. I could have taken oath it had been 6. Time stagnates here. We must surely have retired to rest at 8. Always at 9 in winter, and always rise at 4, said my host, suppressing a groan. And as I fancied, by the motion of the shadow's arm, and as I fancied, by the motion of his shadow's arm, dashing a tear from his eyes. Mr. Lockwood, he added, you may go into my room. You'll only be in the way coming downstairs so early, and your childish outcry has sent sleep to the devil for me. And for me too, I replied. I'll walk in the yard till daylight, and then I'll be off, and you need not dread a repetition of my intrusion. I am now quite cured of seeking pleasure in society, be it country or town. A sensible man ought to find sufficient company in himself. Delightful company, muttered Heathcliff. Take the candle and go where you please. I shall join you directly. Keep out of the yard, though. The dogs are unchained. And the house. Juno mounts sentinel there, and, nay, you can only ramble about the steps and passages, but away with you. I'll come in 2 minutes. I obeyed so far as to quit the chamber, when, ignorant where the narrow lobbies led, I stood still, and was witness, involuntarily, to a piece of superstition on the part of my landlord, which belied, oddly, his apparent sense. He got on to the bed and wrenched open the lattice, bursting as he pulled at it into an uncontrollable passion of tears. Come in, he sobbed. Cathy, do come. Oh, do, once more. Oh, my heart's darling, hear me this time, Catherine, at last. The spectre showed a spectre's ordinary caprice. It gave no sign of being, but the snow and wind whirled wildly through, even reaching my station and blowing out the light. There was such anguish in the gush of grief that accompanied this raving that my compassion made me overlook its folly, and I drew off, half angry to have listened at all, and vexed at having related my ridiculous nightmare, since it produced that agony. Though why was beyond my comprehension. I descended cautiously to the lower regions and landed in the back kitchen, where a gleam of fire, raked compactly together, enabled me to rekindle my candle. Nothing was stirring except a brindled gray cat, which crept from the ashes and saluted me with a querulous mew. Two benches, shaped in sections of a circle, nearly enclosed the hearth. On one of these I stretched myself, and Grimalkin mounted the other. We were both of us nodding ere anyone invaded our retreat, and then it was Joseph, shuffling down a wooden ladder that vanished in the roof through a trap. The ascent to his garret, I suppose. He cast a sinister look at the little flame which I had enticed to play between the ribs, swept the cat from its elevation, and bestowing himself in the vacancy, commenced the operation of stuffing a 3-inch pipe with tobacco. My presence in his sanctum was evidently esteemed a piece of impudence too shameful for remark. He silently applied the tube to his lips, folded his arms, and puffed away. I let him enjoy the luxury unannoyed, and after sucking out the last wreath and heaving a profound sigh, he got up and departed as solemnly as he came. A more elastic footstep entered next, and now I opened my mouth for a good morning, but closed it again, the salutation unachieved, for Hareton Earnshaw was performing his orisons sotto voce in a series of curses directed against every object he touched, while he rummaged a corner for a spade or shovel to dig through the drifts. He glanced over the back of the bench, dilating his nostrils, and thought as little of exchanging civilities with me as with my companion the cat. I guessed by his preparations that egress was allowed, and, leaving my hard couch, made a movement to follow him. He noticed this, and thrust at an inner door with the end of his spade, intimating by an inarticulate sound that there was the place where I must go, if I changed my locality. It opened into the house where the females were already astir, Zillah urging flakes of flame up the chimney with a colossal bellows, and Mrs. Heathcliff kneeling on the hearth, reading a book by the aid of the blaze. She held her hand interposed between the furnace heat and her eyes, and seemed absorbed in her occupation, desisting from it only to chide the servant for covering her with sparks, or to push away a dog, now and then, that snoozled its nose over-forwardly into her face. I was surprised to see Heathcliff there also. He stood by the fire, his back towards me, just finishing a stormy scene to poor Zillah, who ever and anon interrupted her labor to pluck up the corner of her apron and heave an indignant groan. "And you worthless!" he broke out as I entered, turning to his daughter-in-law and employing an epithet as harmless as duck or sheep, but generally represented by a dash. "There you are at your idle tricks again. The rest of them do earn their bread. You live on my charity. Put your trash away and find something to do. You shall pay me for the plague of having you eternally in my sight. Do you hear, damnable jade?" "I'll put my trash away, because you can make me if I refuse," answered the young lady, closing her book and throwing it on a chair. "But I'll not do anything, though you should swear your tongue out, except what I please." Heathcliff lifted his hand, and the speaker sprang to a safer distance, obviously acquainted with its weight. Having no desire to be entertained by a cat and dog combat, I stepped forward briskly, as if eager to partake the warmth of the hearth, and innocent of any knowledge of the interrupted dispute. Each had enough decorum to suspend further hostilities. Heathcliff placed his fists, out of temptation, in his pockets. Mrs. Heathcliff curled her lip and walked to a seat far off, where she kept her word by playing the part of a statue during the remainder of my stay. That was not long. I declined joining their breakfast, and at the first gleam of dawn took an opportunity of escaping into the free air, now clear and still, and cold as impalpable ice. My landlord hallooed for me to stop ere I reached the bottom of the garden, and offered to accompany me across the moor. It was well he did, for the whole hill-back was one billowy white ocean, the swells and falls not indicating corresponding rises and depressions in the ground. Many pits, at least, were filled to a level, and entire ranges of mounds, the refuse of the quarries, blotted out from the chart which my yesterday's walk left pictured in my mind. I had remarked on one side of the road, at intervals of 6 or 7 yards, a line of upright stones, continued through the whole length of the barren. These were erected and daubed with lime on purpose to serve as guides in the dark, and also when a fall, like the present, confounded the deep sweeps on either hand with the firmer path. But, excepting a dirty dot pointing up here and there, all traces of their existence had vanished, and my companion found it necessary to warn me frequently to steer to the right or left when I imagined I was following correctly the windings of the road. We exchanged little conversation, and he halted at the entrance of Thrushcross Park, saying I could make no error there. Our adieux were limited to a hasty bow, and then I pushed forward, trusting to my own resources, for the porter's lodge is untenanted as yet. The distance from the gate to the Grange is 2 miles. I believe I managed to make it 4, what with losing myself among the trees and sinking up to the neck in snow, a predicament which only those who have experienced it can appreciate. At any rate, whatever were my wanderings, the clock chimed 12 as I entered the house, and that gave exactly an hour for every mile of the usual way from Wuthering Heights. My human fixture and her satellites rushed to welcome me, exclaiming tumultuously that they had completely given me up. Everybody conjectured that I perished last night, and they were wondering how they must set about the search for my remains. I bid them be quiet now that they saw me returned, and, benumbed to my very heart, I dragged upstairs, whence, after putting on dry clothes and pacing to and fro 30 or 40 minutes to restore the animal heat, I am adjourned to my study, feeble as a kitten, almost too much so to enjoy the cheerful fire and smoking coffee which the servant has prepared for my refreshment. And now chapter 5. What vain weathercocks we are! I, who had determined to hold myself independent of all social intercourse, and thanked my stars that, at length, I had lighted on a spot where it was next to impracticable, I, weak wretch, after maintaining till dusk a struggle with low spirits and solitude, was finally compelled to strike my colors. And, under pretense of gaining information concerning the necessities of my establishment, I desired Mrs. Dean, when she brought in supper, to sit down while I ate it, hoping sincerely she would prove a regular gossip and either rouse me to animation or lull me to sleep by her talk. "You have lived here a considerable time," I commenced. "Did you not say 16 years? 18, sir. I came when the mistress was married to wait on her. After she died, the master retained me for his housekeeper." Indeed. There ensued a pause. She was not a gossip, I feared, unless about her own affairs, and those could hardly interest me. However, having studied for an interval, with a fist on either knee, and a cloud of meditation over her ruddy countenance, she ejaculated, "Ah, times are greatly changed since then." "Yes," I remarked. "You've seen a good many alterations, I suppose?" "I have, and troubles too," she said. "Oh, I'll turn the talk on my landlord's family," I thought to myself. "A good subject to start. And that pretty girl widow, I should like to know her history, whether she be a native of the country or, as is more probable, an exotic that the surly indigene will not recognize for kin." With this intention, I asked Mrs. Dean why Heathcliff let Thrushcross Grange and preferred living in a situation and residence so much inferior. "Is he not rich enough to keep the estate in good order?" I inquired. "Rich, sir," she returned. "He has nobody knows what money, and every year it increases. Yes, he's rich enough to live in a finer house than this. But he's very near, close-handed, and if he had meant to flit to Thrushcross Grange as soon as he heard of a good tenant, he could not have borne to miss the chance of getting a few hundreds more. It is strange people should be so greedy when they are alone in the world." "He had a son, it seems?" "Yes, he had one. He is dead." "And that young lady, Mrs. Heathcliff, is his widow?" "Yes." "Where did she come from originally?" "Why, sir, she is my late master's daughter. Catherine Linton was her maiden name. I nursed her, poor thing. I did wish Mr. Heathcliff would remove here, and then we might have been together again." "What? Catherine Linton?" I exclaimed, astonished. But a moment's reflection convinced me it was not my ghostly Catherine. "Then," I continued, "my predecessor's name was Linton?" "It was." "And who is that Earnshaw, Hareton Earnshaw, who lives with Mr. Heathcliff? Are they relations?" "No, he is the late Mrs. Linton's nephew." "The young lady's cousin, then?" "Yes, and her husband was her cousin also, one on the mother's, the other on the father's side. Heathcliff married Mr. Linton's sister." "I see the house at Wuthering Heights has Earnshaw carved over the front door. Are they an old family? Very old, sir, and Hareton is the last of them, as our Miss Cathy is of us. I mean, of the Lintons. Have you been to Wuthering Heights? I beg pardon for asking, but I should like to hear how she is. Mrs. Heathcliff? She looked very well and very handsome, yet, I think, not very happy. Oh dear, I don't wonder. And how did you like the master? A rough fellow, rather, Mrs. Dean. Is not that his character? Rough as a saw edge and hard as a whinstone. The less you meddle with him, the better. He must have had some ups and downs in life to make him such a churl. Do you know anything of his history? It's a cuckoo's, sir. I know all about it, except where he was born, and who were his parents, and how he got his money at first. And Hareton has been cast out like an unfledged dunnock. The unfortunate lad is the only one in all this parish that does not guess how he has been cheated. Well, Mrs. Dean, it will be a charitable deed to tell me something of my neighbors. I fear I shall not rest if I go to bed, so be good enough to sit and chat an hour. Oh, certainly, sir. I'll just fetch a little sewing, and then I'll sit as long as you please. But you've caught cold. I see you shivering, and you must have some gruel to drive it out. The worthy woman bustled off, and I crouched nearer the fire. My head felt hot, and the rest of me chill. Moreover, I was excited, almost to a pitch of foolishness, through my nerves and brain. This caused me to feel not uncomfortable, but rather fearful, as I am still, of serious effects from the incidents of today and yesterday. She returned presently, bringing a smoking basin and a basket of work, and having placed the former on the hob, drew in her seat, evidently pleased to find me so companionable. Before I came to live here, she commenced, waiting no further invitation to her story, I was almost always at Wuthering Heights, because my mother had nursed Mr. Hindley Earnshaw, that was Hareton's father, and I got used to playing with the children. I ran errands too, and helped to make hay, and hung about the farm ready for anything that anybody would set me to. One fine summer morning, it was the beginning of harvest, I remember, Mr. Earnshaw, the old master, came downstairs dressed for a journey, and after he had told Joseph what was to be done during the day, he turned to Hindley and Cathy and me, for I sat eating my porridge with them, and he said, speaking to his son, Now, my bonny man, I'm going to Liverpool today. What shall I bring you? You may choose what you like, only let it be little, for I shall walk there and back, 60 miles each way. That is a long spell. Hindley named a fiddle, and then he asked Miss Cathy. She was hardly 6 years old, but she could ride any horse in the stable, and she chose a whip. He did not forget me, for he had a kind heart, though he was rather severe sometimes. He promised to bring me a pocketful of apples and pears, and then he kissed his children good-bye and set off. It seemed a long while to us all, the 3 days of his absence, and often did little Cathy ask when he would be home. Mrs. Earnshaw expected him by supper time on the third evening, and she put the meal off hour after hour. There were no signs of his coming, however, and at last the children got tired of running down to the gate to look. Then it grew dark. She would have had them to bed, but they begged sadly to be allowed to stay up, and just about 11 o'clock, the door latch was raised quietly, and in stepped the master. He threw himself into a chair, laughing and groaning, and bid them all stand off, for he was nearly killed. He would not have such another walk for the 3 kingdoms. And at the end of it, to be flighted to death, he said, opening his greatcoat, which he held bundled up in his arms. See here, wife, I was never so beaten with anything in my life, but you must e'en take it as a gift of God, though it's as dark almost as if it came from the devil. We crowded round, and over Miss Cathy's head I had a peep at a dirty, ragged, black-haired child. Big enough both to walk and talk. Indeed, its face looked older than Catherine's. Yet when it was set on its feet, it only stared round and repeated over and over again some gibberish that nobody could understand. I was frightened, and Mrs. Earnshaw was ready to fling it out of doors. She did fly up, asking how he could fashion to bring that little gypsy brat into the house, what he meant to do with it, and whether he were mad. The master tried to explain the matter, but he was really half dead with fatigue, and all that I could make out, amongst her scolding, was a tale of his seeing it starving, and houseless, and as good as dumb in the streets of Liverpool, where he picked it up and inquired for its owner. Not a soul knew to whom it belonged, he said, and his money and time being both limited, he thought it better to take it home with him at once than run into vain expenses there, because he was determined he would not leave it as he found it. Well, the conclusion was that my mistress grumbled herself calm, and Mr. Earnshaw told me to wash it and give it clean things, and let it sleep with the children. Hindley and Cathy contented themselves with looking and listening till peace was restored. Then both began searching their father's pockets for the presents he had promised them. The former was a boy of 14, but when he drew out what had been a fiddle, crushed to morsels in the great coat, he blubbered aloud. And Cathy, when she learnt the master had lost his whip in attending on the stranger, showed her humor by grinning and spitting at the stupid little thing, earned for her pains a sound blow from her father to teach her cleaner manners. They entirely refused to have it in bed with them or even in their room, and I had no more sense, so I put it on the landing of the stairs, hoping it might be gone on the morrow. By chance, or else attracted by hearing its voice, or his voice, it crept to Mr. Earnshaw's door, and there he found it on quitting his chamber. Inquiries were made as to how it got there. I was obliged to confess, and in recompense for my cowardice and inhumanity, was sent out of the house. This was Heathcliff's first introduction to the family. On coming back a few days afterward, for I did not consider my banishment perpetual, I found they had christened him Heathcliff. It was the name of a son who died in childhood, and it had served him ever since, both for Christian and it has served him ever since, both for Christian and surname. Miss Cathy and he were now very thick, but Hindley hated him, and to say the truth, I did the same. And we plagued and went on with him shamefully, for I wasn't reasonable enough to feel my injustice, and the mistress never put in a word on his behalf when she saw him wronged. He seemed a sullen, patient child, hardened perhaps to ill treatment. He would stand Hindley's blows without winking or shedding a tear, and my pinches moved him only to draw in a breath and open his eyes, as if he had hurt himself by accident and nobody was to blame. This endurance made old Earnshaw furious when he discovered his son persecuting the poor fatherless child, as he called him. He took to Heathcliff strangely, believing all he said. For that matter, he said precious little, and generally the truth, and petting him up far above Cathy, who was too mischievous and wayward for a favorite. So, from the very beginning, he bred bad feeling in the house, and at Mrs. Earnshaw's death, which happened in less than 2 years after, the young master had learnt to regard his father as an oppressor rather than a friend, and Heathcliff as a usurper of his father's affections and his privileges, and he grew bitter with brooding over those injuries. I sympathized a while, but when the children fell ill of the measles and I had to tend them and take on me the cares of a woman at once, I changed my ideas. Heathcliff was dangerously sick, and while he lay at the worst, he would have me constantly by his pillow. I suppose he felt I did a good deal for him, and he hadn't the wit to guess that I was compelled to do it. However, I will say this. He was the quietest child that ever nurse watched over. The difference between him and the others forced me to be less partial. Cathy and her brother harassed me terribly. He was as uncomplaining as a lamb, though hardness, not gentleness, made him give little trouble. He got through, and the doctor affirmed it was in a great measure owing to me, and praised me for my care. I was vain of his commendations and softened toward the being by whose means I earned them, and thus Hindley lost his last ally. Still, I couldn't dote on Heathcliff, and I wondered often what my master saw to admire so much in the sullen boy, who never, to my recollection, repaid his indulgence by any sign of gratitude. He was not insolent to his benefactor. He was simply insensible, though knowing perfectly the hold he had on his heart, and conscious he had only to speak, and all the house would be obliged to bend to his wishes. As an instance, I remember Mr. Earnshaw once bought a couple of colts at the parish fair, and gave the lads each one. Heathcliff took the handsomest, but it soon fell lame, and when he discovered it, he said to Hindley, "You must exchange horses with me. I don't like mine, and if you won't, I shall tell your father of the 3 thrashings you've given me this week, and show him my arm, which is black to the shoulder." Hindley put out his tongue and cuffed him over the ears. "You'd better do it at once," he persisted, escaping to the porch. They were in the stable. "You will have to, and if I speak of these blows, you'll get them again, with interest." "Off, dog!" cried Hindley, threatening him with an iron weight used for weighing potatoes and hay. "Throw it," he replied, standing still, "and then I'll tell how you boasted that you would turn me out of doors as soon as he died, and see whether he will not turn you out directly." Hindley threw it, hitting him on the breast, and down he fell, but staggered up immediately, breathless and white. And, had not I prevented it, he would have gone just so to the master, and got full revenge by letting his condition plead for him, intimating who had caused it. "Take my colt, gypsy, then," said young Earnshaw, "and I pray that he may break your neck. Take him, and be damned, you beggarly interloper, and wheedle my father out of all he has. Only afterwards show him what you are, imp of Satan. And take that. I hope he'll kick out your brains." Heathcliff had gone to loose the beast and shift it to his own stall. He was passing behind it when Hindley finished his speech by knocking him under its feet, and without stopping to examine whether his hopes were fulfilled, ran away as fast as he could. I was surprised to witness how coolly the child gathered himself up and went on with his intention, exchanging saddles and all, and then sitting down on a bundle of hay to overcome the qualm which the violent blow occasioned before he entered the house. I persuaded him easily to let me lay the blame of his bruises on the horse. He minded little what tale was told, since he had what he wanted. He complained so seldom indeed of such stirs as these, that I really thought him not vindictive. I was deceived completely, as you will hear. That concludes today's reading from Wuthering Heights. We'll learn tomorrow a bit more about the history of Heathcliff and Hindley and Cathy, the family over at Wuthering Heights. Thank you very much for joining me. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye, friends.